Welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. I'm Ulrike Schede. I'm the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology here at UCSD. We are actually at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. GPS is an international relations and public policy school with a focus on the Pacific. If you're interested in our programs, including our Masters in International Affairs with a Japan specialization, please look at gps.ucsd.edu. JFIT is our Japan Center, and more information on JFIT is at jfit.ucsd.edu. We also have a newsflash and some other Japan-related activities. If you're interested in subscribing to this newsflash, go to our website, jfit.ucsd.edu, and then find the news and media button where you can sign up. That's actually co-located with the Japan Zoominars tab, and there you can find our past recordings of this Japan Zoominar. I also have a website where I also have these past recordings, so you could go to thejapanologist.com. So the Zoominar is a weekly thing. We meet every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m., which in the winter is 9:30 a.m. in Tokyo. And of course, we're going to talk about immigration in East Asia today. Next week, we shift to contemporary Japanese art. And we'll have AJ Kiyoizumi, who works at Christie's New York, where she's in charge of contemporary Japanese art. Followed in February by revisiting the late Ezra Vogel's impact on Japan business research and economic research. And later in February on whether or not entrepreneurship can be taught and Japanese industrial policies toward fostering innovation. So today, let me go straight to our topic today. We'll have Professor Chung. So let me kind of stop my share and introduce her. There she is. Hello, Professor Erin Chung. Thank you for joining me today. And so let me introduce you and see whether I can do justice to your fabulous CV. Professor Chung is the Charles D. Miller Associate Professor of East Asian Politics at Johns Hopkins University, which she will be quick to point out is actually in Baltimore, Maryland. And she's one of the most impactful East Asia scholars and comparative scholars right now. She's done an awful lot of things on Korea and Japan, and now she's adding Taiwan to the mix. Erin holds a BA in politics from UC Santa Cruz. She is, in fact, actually originally sort of a California girl, and then moved on to the University of Washington, Seattle, where she earned her MA in International Studies, and then was drawn to the East. She earned her PhDs in political science from Northwestern. And so then she moved to Baltimore. She's done a lot of different things. Her CV is really impressive. She's done summer study at Yonsei University in Korea, the IUC Japanese language program. And this is important because we're going to talk about her immersion and fieldwork in those countries today. The IUC Yokohama program, that is. She was a visiting professor at the University of Tokyo and at Korea University, an advanced research fellow at Harvard, and has served at Johns Hopkins as a director of East Asian Studies and the program on racism, immigration, and citizenship, which is actually what her work is about, in particular the latter two. She's written 4 books, including a 2010 book on immigration and citizenship in Japan. And by my count, which may be undercounting the reality, she has 19 peer-reviewed papers, a lot of it on South Korea and Japan and the Zainichi in Japan and Japanese in Korea. It has been funded by the Japan Foundation and the Mance Foundation and other important places. So it's fantastic. Erin, thank you for joining us today. We're going to talk about your new book, which is Immigration Incorporation. And those of you who registered for today's event will, in your mail tomorrow or even maybe today, receive a discount coupon from the publisher. So look out for that in your mailbox. So immigration incorporation in East Asian democracies. Erin, thank you for joining me today, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to join you. And also, I was very excited to see the people who signed up. So many of you, some are colleagues and students that I know. And I even recognized a couple of names from my field research, which was very exciting to see. And it's really wonderful to at least virtually join you in sunny San Diego, while we're in the middle of a very cold winter here in Baltimore.
So we've decided that we want to do this as a conversation today. You'll share some PowerPoints later on, but basically we're going to have a conversation about your book and the findings and the implications. So audience, if you would like to raise some questions for Professor Chung, so you could just type them in Q&A, and I will then see how I can manage to weave them into our conversation, right? And as I said, this meeting is recorded, so I will refer to you, audience, when you ask a question only by your first name to protect your privacy. So, Erin, what's the motivation for writing this book? I mean, this is interesting. Why compare Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan?
Well, thanks for that question. And also thank you for the wonderful introduction. So I started this project shortly after the publication of my first book on immigration and citizenship in Japan, which basically sought to understand how it was that Japan was one of the few liberal democracies where immigration did not occupy center stage in politics. And I basically argue that contemporary immigration and citizenship politics in Japan really reflect the strategic interaction between state efforts to control immigration on the one hand and grassroots movements by multi-generational Korean resident activists to gain rights and recognition specifically as permanently settled foreign residents, which ironically has created a type of political equilibrium, by the way. So I wanted to extend my research on immigration politics in Japan to South Korea and Taiwan because they represent three very, very similar cases, right? So they're all relatively rich liberal democracies that have dissent-based citizenship policies and are also among the most restrictive, immigration policies in the world, right? And the dominant comparative scholarship on immigration and citizenship has tended to focus on cultural determinants, especially claims of ethno-cultural homogeneity to explain this paradox. According to this account, East Asian democracies really represent this kind of exclusionary or ethnic citizenship and immigration regime that tend to privilege dissent over liberal norms, right? And I found these accounts unsatisfying because they really overlook the significant cross-national variations between the three countries, as well as intranational contradictions, right? They also tell us very little about immigrants themselves as political actors in their own right. So by comparing three East Asian democracies with overlapping citizenship and immigration policies, I really wanted to analyze what the process of immigrant incorporation was like among these so-called exclusionary cases. And also as an immigrant myself, I wanted to document the voices of immigrants in other parts of the world to better understand the political choices that they make as they become permanent members of their receiving societies. And that's why the bulk of my research, which is based on field research that I conducted over a 31-month period in the three countries, really consists of interviews with migrants, activists, and government officials, as well as archival research. But the heart of it is that are the focus groups that I did with over 20 immigrant communities.
So they are similar, they're grouped because they're dissent, the citizenship rules are dissent based, right? The other country that I know something about that used to have that rule is Germany. So you could easily become a German or a Japanese or a Korean if any of your forefathers were German, but you couldn't if they weren't. Right, even if you were born in that country, is that the commonality between these three, or are there other commonalities in the three countries?
So Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan go a step further, right? So they are quite similar to what Germany used to be like in their descent-based citizenship policies, except that one, descent goes indefinitely, right? So basically, you can be sixth generation, which, you have 6 generations of foreign residents in Japan and South Korea now, and yet still not have automatic access to nationality. Whereas even in Germany's case, after the 3rd generation, a citizenship acquisition became more automatic. So that's kind of one extreme. And the other extreme is that co-ethnics, like you were suggesting in the German case, do not actually have automatic access to nationality in these 3 countries. So even if you are a co-ethnic Korean, immigrating to South Korea, or a co-ethnic Japanese, like the Nikkei Jin going to Japan, you don't have even extra privileges, in terms of gaining citizenship in Japan. So it's both kind of a more extended form of descent, but also a much more limited type of descent-based citizenship policies.
So since I just mentioned Europe and North America, so can you talk for those of us who don't actually study immigration? We know it's important. We've seen articles about it, but so it's not my field. So I'm not an expert. I've now read your book. I think I know much more. But how do immigration politics in East Asian democracies compare to, let's say, the United States or Europe in general? What are the big sort of markers that make the East Asian countries different?
Well, of course, there's this basic similarities, as liberal democracies, the states in East Asian democracies, share the common challenges of addressing market demands for labor while controlling national borders from unwanted or unsanctioned immigration, and at the same time, at least on paper, upholding democratic principles. But immigration levels in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are extremely low relative to each country's levels of development, which is why they're often described as negative cases of immigration, compared to their European counterparts, for example, that have experienced heightened immigration since the mid-1960s and 1970s. The 3 countries' recent encounters came much later, with the lion's share arriving from the late 1980s from other parts of Asia. And while the total foreign population has grown by 2-fold in Japan, over 3-fold in Taiwan, and over 12-fold in Korea, immigrants continue to make up a relatively small percentage of the total population in all 3 countries, at about 2 to 4%. And all 3 countries continue to maintain highly restrictive immigration policies that either prohibit or at least discourage the permanent settlement of unskilled foreign workers. And, basically you would expect that, the fact that they have common dilemmas, as liberal democracies, and, all 3 countries have since 2005 competed with each other for the less than desirable distinction, of having the world's fastest aging population, the lowest birth rate, and, most rapidly shrinking workforce. You would expect, that they would have higher immigration levels, but they don't. And that is, what we might call the East Asian paradox.
So, is that the East Asian model? Would it be an overstretch to say the East Asian model is, yes, there are democracies, yes, there are liberal values, but when it comes to citizenship, they're actually quite restrictive, all 3 of them?
Well, when I started the study, I expected to find a singular, or at least a similar model of immigrant incorporation among the 3 Northeast Asian countries, largely because they have very similar immigration and citizenship policies. In fact, in South Korea's case, South Korea's immigration policies were almost complete carbon copies of those of Japan. They also have overlapping immigrant populations, largely from neighboring Asian countries. countries as well as co-ethnics. And also, like I said, they have their common dilemmas as liberal democracies. But instead, I actually found dramatic cross-national variations between these three seemingly similar systems, especially from the mid-2000s. So in Korea's case, the arrival of migrant labor from the late 1980s generated centralized rights-based movements and eventually sweeping policy measures that included the implementation of a guest worker program in 2004, the extension of local voting rights to permanent foreign residents in 2006, which is the first and only country to do so in Asia, and the passage of a dual nationality bill in 2010. Again, this is the first in Northeast Asia. And none of these developments occurred in Japan or Taiwan. In Japan's case, there were no policy reforms that were significant, but decentralized grassroots movements and partnerships between local governments and civil society organizations generated an assortment of local services and programs that ranged from what we might expect, like cultural exchange programs and so forth, but also housing and employment assistance and foreign resident assemblies. And foreign resident rights and social welfare provisions for those who are already settled within Japan are among the most generous of liberal democracies. And while Taiwan was the first among the three countries to implement a guest worker program in 1989, it's actually been the slowest in addressing immigrant rights and welfare, labor protections for migrant workers, as well as local support services for foreign residents. So we see these very divergent immigrant incorporation patterns emerging out of similarly restrictive immigration and citizenship policies.
So if I understand your main thesis correctly, so let me see whether I'll pass test, right, and can get a credit for this class. So initially, these, at the first sight, these three countries look the same, and their policies are actually not dissimilar. Mm-hmm. There might be differences, but fundamentally similar. However, at the real level, at the level of what's actually happening on the ground, there are, of course, these civic societies that help the integration of the immigrants after they've arrived. And the real outcomes across these three countries are different because the civic societies that are in charge of this incorporation reflect their own goals and purposes onto the immigration issue. So in the Korean case, it's about rights, right? Whether that's labor rights or political rights, or that's a big issue in Korea because Korea has not been a democracy quite that long, right? And in Japan, it's about equality or inclusion, because Japan, and according to your book, still has some of these patterns of excluding certain parts of society, women, long list of things we can talk about. And then in Taiwan, it's more about ethnicity. And so therefore we get these different civic societies and then fight for the rights of these immigrants, and they reflect these things. So in Korea, the legal right and standing are the most important thing, and in Japan it's inclusion and so forth. Is that about right?
Yes, so you did capture it very nicely. Thank you. Thank you so much for your close reading. So basically, if we looked at policy alone, right, we could actually expect that all three countries would have actually followed Taiwan's trajectory, right? Because, global human rights norms had not really pushed the three countries toward liberal immigration and citizenship policies. And, domestic political elites, such as, bureaucrats or left-leaning parties, were not really the drivers for immigration liberalization or even kind of expanded migrant rights, but rather immigration reform and immigrant incorporation, as well as migrant rights, became an important part of the equation only when civil society actors really force them onto the agenda. But the point that I want to make is that civil society alone, right, the presence of civil society alone is not a necessary or insufficient condition, right, for immigration liberalization, because not all civil society actors in Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan sought to advocate for migrant rights or even incorporate migrants into their local societies, because we know that civil society can be both the source of both pro-migrant advocacy as well as anti-migrant mobilization, right? So rather than assume that civil society actors confront the challenges of immigrant incorporation in a uniform way, or that civil society actors necessarily seek to incorporate immigrants in their local societies, I introduce the concept that you mentioned of civic legacies to refer to the ideas and networks, as well as strategies that were applied in past struggles for democratic inclusion that really shape the direction of immigrant incorporation, as well as the potential for structural reform. So in other words, the language, the symbols and strategies that were used in past struggles by women, by workers and other minorities shape how civil society actors, including migrants themselves, give voice to migrant interests, how they mobilize migrant actors and shape public debate and policy on immigration. So we should expect to find that civil society mobilization and advocacy for non-citizens will thus mirror those that were applied to preceding generations of citizen women, workers, minority groups, and others who have historically been denied full citizenship status and rights. And so I'm going to extend a bit of what you're saying for each case. Again, thank you for capturing it so succinctly. And I'd like to show just a few slides, just a few pictures, so that I can kind of give you a more clear visual of what I mean. So let me just start by saying that migrant advocacy in South Korea, as you said, really built on the civic legacies of the country's recent democratization movement, and especially the strong tradition of labor and civil society activism to push for structural change. So, not only did the mistreatment of migrant workers, as well as the police crackdowns of undocumented migrants, resonate really strikingly with the abusive practices and political repression of Korea's past authoritarian regimes, but the language and tactics that migrant workers used in their public demonstrations and their declarations and sit-in rallies were almost identical to those of the labor movements in Korea's recent past. So
before you show, could I just ask, say one more thing, and maybe
sure.
maybe that's like, so Japan and South Korea are very different in many ways. They look similar, but very different in very many ways, right? The one thing that, if you maybe can explain this while you're explaining this larger issue, is that in Korea there are lots of demonstrations. People are what in Japanese we would call urusai, right? They're noisy. They make a lot of noise. Even a few years ago, I remember there were homeless demonstrations. And I don't think there's a group in Korea that hasn't demonstrated, right? Whereas in Japan, we never see any demonstrations. And if there is one, maybe there are some groups, of course, that are unhappy and express their unhappiness, but they're usually very polite and rather quiet and often small, right? And that is one of the big difference, I think, between the two countries that you're picking up on. Is that right?
Yes, yes. And those are precisely the civic legacies that I'm referring to. So, in Korea's case, as you're saying, these kind of centralized mass demonstrations, right, as a way to make claims to the state. In Japan's case, you're talking more about, not these kind of centralized national demonstrations, but grassroots, locally based types of, civil society community, local government types of cooperative arrangements, and as well as even movements, but they usually tend to be more decentralized. And then Taiwan's case, as you mentioned, really focus more on ethnicity-based coalitions, right? So definitely, so rather than the policies themselves, I am, I actually privilege more the civic legacies, as I put it, in terms of understanding these kind of patterns of immigrant incorporation. So let's look at the Udasai, South Korean demonstration. So in South Korea's case, the migrant workers movement, really utilize these past types of symbols and strategies and networks, and so such that you see slogans such as, we are human, not animals, and we are not slaves, came to epitomize the migrant workers movements, much like we are not machines represented the Korean workers movements of the 1970s and 1980s. And here I'm showing you comparing a slide that compares anti-government protests during the 1980s democratization movement and a migrant worker protest in 2003 that was led by the Korean Federation of Trade Unions, which is the most powerful trade union in Korea. And you can see that this kind of confrontational repertoire is very, very similar, and the ways in which they interact with the riot police, and even some of the symbols that they're wearing in their clothing, and certainly what they're chanting, and even the fact that they came prepared with face masks and so forth, is very similar there. And these are very deliberate types of overlaps. And this is another comparison from June 1987, a June 1987 protest and a November 2003 protest in front of Myeongdong Cathedral in Seoul, which has been described as the traditional stage and refuge of anti-government protesters in the era of military rule, right? So even the site of protest has been replicated, and this has provided the migrant workers movement with much more political capital, right, than they would have otherwise gotten, given their small numbers, as well as their lack of cultural assimilation, right? So that's a similarity that I wanted to point out. Now, Japan's case is, as you mentioned, quite a bit different. So in Japan, grassroots movements that were led by generations of Korean residents really set the foundation for these decentralized, community-based strategies for incorporating new immigrants. But at the same time, they posed barriers to restructuring migrant labor policies. So unlike Korea, Japan had a seemingly natural ally for new migrants, that is the multi-generational Korean residents known as Zainichi Koreans, who had succeeded in gaining rights and recognition for foreign residents through what I call a non-citizen civil rights movement. So by the time that Japan encountered its most recent wave of immigration from the late 1980s, Zainichi Korean activists and their supporters had reached the final stages of their movement, which had begun with the landmark Hitachi employment discrimination trial of the early 1970s, in which a Korean plaintiff successfully sued the Hitachi company for employment discrimination, to claims to citizenship rights and access to the labor market through lawsuits and local campaigns. So by 1980, foreign residents were already eligible for social welfare benefits and public sector jobs in cities such as Nagoya, Osaka, Kawasaki, Kobe, and Tokyo. And this is a slide of one of the famous anti-fingerprinting rally, which is a decade-long a movement that succeeded in abolishing the fingerprinting requirement for Zainichi Koreans who had the special permanent resident status, as well as all foreign residents in 1999. Now, this fingerprinting requirement, was reinstated in 2007 for all foreign residents except for Zainichi Koreans. So it's a very specific exception. And I'm showing you this slide. This is from the cover of my first book. And it's quite a contrast from the previous slide in that, in Japanese, we would call it sabishi, right? It's like there are probably more media than there are actual protesters at, in this rally. And what I think is most significant is the very paltry presence of Zainichi Koreans. There's you see just a few protesters here, and they joined this rally at the very last minute and brought in this kind of anti-fingerprinting symbol from the original movement because they basically got so many calls to join the rally, and they're representing the youth organization of Korean residents in Japan rather than even one of the more kind of powerful organizations. And I wanted to show you this slide because it really demonstrates that rather than kind of lead the movement for immigration reform and the expansion of migrant worker rights, Zainichi Korean activists have largely distanced themselves from migrant workers and instead have absorbed new migrants into existing programs and movements that reflect more the interests of their multi-generational community and less those of recent migrants. So this means that on the one hand, immigrants with a secure legal status really benefited from the civic legacies of earlier movements by Zainichi Koreans, that made foreign residents eligible for a range of social welfare protections, benefits and legal protections. But on the other hand, because existing foreign resident services and programs were created for permanently settled, highly assimilated, and in many cases, native-born, non-national residents, most local communities were ill-equipped to address some of the specific needs of migrant workers. And especially because the Zainichi Korean movement from the 1960s made claims to citizenship rights on the basis of their permanent settlement as tax-paying and law-abiding residents. This ideational frame that was known as kind of the foreign resident citizen or gaikokujin shimin widened the gap between legally registered long-term foreign residents and unauthorized migrant workers. And finally, I just want to bring up something from Taiwan's count. So the civic legacies of Taiwan's recent democratization movement really hampered migrant advocacy, as the latter proved to be a poor fit for indigenization campaigns and became ensnared in cross-strait politics. So rather than focus on areas of solidarity, as we see in Korea's case, Taiwanese labor union leaders, especially those that represent workers in the construction and manufacturing industries, which have historically had significant concentrations of Aborigine workers, have been among the most vocal critics of foreign workers who they claim have stolen jobs from Taiwanese citizens and depressed wages. And these conflicting interests among civil society groups within Taiwan are exacerbated by the peculiar configuration of migrant labor in contemporary Taiwan. Specifically, about a third of all foreign workers in Taiwan are engaged in domestic labor, most ostensibly as caregivers for the elderly. And because they work and live in the private homes of their employers, they're excluded from labor rights protections as they're not considered to be workers by the state. So I'm showing you a slide from the Where is My Day Off rally. The first the bigger one is from the 2011 rally, and another one on the campaign for day off, and National Domestic Workers Day in 2018, and the signs that are being held right here say every week day off, domestic work is work, and no harassment, violence, overwork. And I should just note that among the workers that I interviewed who were domestic workers, some of them reported that they had a day off maybe once a month, whereas others reported they had a day off every 6 months or maybe even every year. And some that I interviewed had never had a day off from their work. So this situation is really compounded by the growth of local NGOs that represent the caregivers' employers, that is the elderly, the disabled, and working women, whose interests often conflict with those of the caregivers and their supporters. So for example, women's groups and social welfare NGOs, as well as NGOs that represent the elderly and the disabled, have lobbied actively against a proposal to adopt the Household Services Act, which would actually regulate domestic work and provide labor protections, including a day off of work. So instead of providing a receptive environment for immigrant incorporation, Taiwan's civic legacies stemming from the contentious struggle for democratization as well as indigenization, representation of local Taiwanese, within the framework of cross-strait relations, left migrant workers with very few allies among civil society actors who saw no place for them in Taiwan's democratic project. So instead of a single East Asian model of immigrant incorporation, I argue that national immigration policies established the parameters for legal entry, employment, and length of stay. But in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan's cases, civic legacies presented both the opportunities as well as the hurdles for migrants and their supporters to give voice to their interests, as well as make claims to the state and form solidarity networks.
Terrific. While we have it's a little bit off the larger question to which I will return momentarily, but you mentioned the fingerprinting, and I wanted to just explain this for the audience because things have changed a little bit, I think. Mm-hmm. But I do recall when I first became a sort of a resident, I guess, as a student, as a PhD student in Japan, I had to go to the local office and have my fingerprints taken. And that is not something that Japanese have to do, right? And so only foreigners have to have their finger printed. And the sort of the connotation was that gaijin, right, the foreigners may be thieves or robbers or bad people, and so we need to be able to identify them. Whether that was meant like that or not, I don't know, but it sure felt a little bit weird that I would be, I would have to have by the way, the United States does the same thing, but mm-hmm. that's not the point here. But you have this, the point is that you have this very interesting episode, sort of in here, anecdote, I guess, where the Korean movement was successful in removing the fingerprinting obligation for the immigrants. But for legacy purposes, there was actually still a fingerprinting obligation for the citizens. So in Korea, it was turned upside down, where the citizens were fingerprinted, but the immigrants were not. And then that had to somehow resolve themselves. I thought that it was a fabulous example of your basic message, right? That the civic societies are pushing these rights, even though it might not even be congruent with whatever the norms of the country at the time are.
Right, and the language that was used in South Korea's case for getting rid of the fingerprinting requirement for foreign residents was precisely kind of in solidarity with Zainichi Koreans, right, in Japan, right, saying that if South Korea demonstrates that it can be the leader, right, in getting rid of the fingerprinting requirements for foreign residents, then Japan would follow, right? So it was actually quite ironic that it turned out that way.
They're very ironic, but it still exists in Japan, right?
Yes. So in 2007, it was reinstated for foreign residents, as I said, for all foreign residents except for Zainichi Koreans, those who have the special permanent resident status. And this was largely a kind of a post 9/11 initiative.
So we have questions from the audience come in, and one on this point while we're talking about the Zainichi, which are of course the Koreans that have for many generations been in Japan. Are they? Is it still okay to think of them as a unified group? Robbie wants to know whether there's a Zainichi split into factions, in particular, of course, the North-South. Groups, right? Do you have any insights on that?
Well, right. I mean, when we think of, Zainichi Koreans, we probably think first of the two organizations that purport to represent them, right? The pro-North Korean Chosen Soren, and then the pro-South Korean Mindan. So, this kind of what was called the 38th parallel in Japan during the height of the Cold War was kind of the lens through which many of us kind of studied Zainichi Koreans for a while, but within the Zainichi community, so they weren't even called Zainichi until the late 1960s to their early 1970s. Basically, the leaders of Chung or Soren and Mindan were largely from the first generation of colonial era migrants who were focusing more on kind of homeland politics and repatriation, to their respective homelands, right? And that's in quotes because the vast majority of Zainichi Koreans are from the southern part of Korea, even those who have a Chosenseki, or the kind of de facto North Korean nationality. But it was the kind of second generation and on that created this new movement that was focusing more on their permanent residence in Japan rather than on kind of the idea of returning to this mythic homeland that they had, many of whom had never even been to or were not familiar with. And so the Zainichi movement was focused much more on kind of their civil rights and social welfare access as these permanent residents. That they, like I said before, they were really characterizing themselves as tax-paying, law-abiding, contributing members of their local communities who happen to have, foreign citizenship.
So your book is a large portion of the book is a very carefully done analysis of your work with focus groups. And you actually you didn't just write this, at your desk, and draw some conclusions. You spent an awful lot of time with field research and with these focus groups. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience there? What were the striking differences or similarities between these focus groups in the three countries?
Right. So as I mentioned earlier, I conducted focus groups with over 20 immigrant communities in the three countries. And to my knowledge, no other study has actually utilized original focus group data of multiple foreign communities in these three countries. And this was conducted between 2010 and 2013. And the field research was from 2009 to 2016. And so some of the groups that I interviewed were Chinese, Korean, Brazilian, Peruvian, Filipino, Bangladeshi, and Ethiopian residents in Japan, Vietnamese, Chinese Han, Chinese, ethnic Korean Chinese, Taiwanese, Filipino, Mongolian, and Burmese immigrants in Korea, and Vietnamese, Indonesian, Filipino, Thai, mainland Chinese, and Malaysian residents in Taiwan. And obviously, I had a pretty substantial team of research assistants who spoke the respective languages of these immigrant communities. And by the way, 16 of the Japan and Korea focus groups from the study have been archived by the Johns Hopkins University Data Management Services and are available for download to the public as a primary source for students, researchers with proper attribution. So if you just look either on my website or if you just look up the Immigrant Incorporation East Asian Democracies Project, then you'll find the Dataverse. So basically, I was really struck. So some of the striking similarities were that the experiences across the focus group were quite similar. The participants across Japan, Korea, and Taiwan expressed some ambivalence toward naturalization, even as they sought citizenship rights and engaged in citizenship practices in their local communities. So the most common reason for their hesitancy with naturalization was that they said that citizenship acquisition would not necessarily guarantee social acceptance as fellow Japanese, Korean, and Taiwanese citizens. And in Japan, the focus group participants noted that acquiring Japanese nationality could actually lead to increased harassment if they didn't fit into the dominant understandings of who a Japanese is. For example, among the kind of phenotypically distinct Black and brown migrants, holding a Japanese passport could provoke questions about the authenticity of their documents and their citizenship status, because, as one of the Ethiopian participants put it, without Japanese blood, I can't be Tanaka, right? And then for others, the costs of naturalization were too high, given that permanent residency status accorded them with kind of equivalent citizenship rights. But in Korea and Taiwan, citizenship acquisition was viewed as the only route through which migrants could actually legally remain permanently in either country. So there was hesitancy, but at the same time, there was kind of this idea that I have to, right? There's if I want to stay in this country permanently, I have to become a citizen. In all three countries, participants also commented on the way that they were criminalized as kind of illegal migrants, regardless of their actual legal status. And the last really interesting similarity that I saw was how participants described patterns of discrimination that were based on migrant subcategories, right? So, for example, participants across Japan, Korea, and Taiwan noted the differential treatment of Asian versus Western foreigners, right? They noted that whereas, foreigners with blonde hair, as a participant in my South Korean focus group noted in Japan, were praised for speaking a few words of Japanese or Korean or Mandarin. Asian foreigners were admonished for not speaking fluently enough. And participants in Japan, also commented on the politics of visibility and invisibility. So, like the Chinese, South Korean, Filipino, and ethnic Japanese, Brazilian, and Peruvians all noted the pressure that they felt to make themselves invisible, in Japan, so that they wouldn't really bother Japanese. But the phenotypically distinct Black and brown immigrants, specifically the male participants in my Bangladeshi and Ethiopian focus groups, consistently brought up their experience with police harassment as a result of their visibility. Now, another kind of a striking difference that I noticed among the three countries really related more to their specific patterns of political mobilization, right, and political socialization, rather than their actual experiences. So, there was some variation according to factors such as country of origin or legal status, but the dominant patterns were actually nationally specific and reflected the civic legacies of each country. So, for example, focus group participants in Japan, on the whole, prioritize local community participation, local voting rights, and collaboration with local governments and organizations, right? Very few were interested in actual structural reform. But in South Korea's case, the focus group participants applied explicitly the language of rights, with the understanding that, as one participant in the Chinese focus group put it, in Korea, human rights are meant to protect everyone, right? And then finally, participants in Taiwan identified public education as a strategy to change what they referred to as the hearts and minds of Taiwanese publics toward migrants, right? So again, it wasn't so much focused on structural reform as kind of interpersonal relations.
So Angela has a question that actually preempted my next question, which is about your chapter 5. And chapter 5 is titled Marriage Migrants. And Angela's question is whether there isn't a quite significant difference between Korea and Japan in terms of Korea being quite open to such marriage migrants, and in Japan not so much, maybe?
Well, I would say that all three countries actually converge in terms of their proactive efforts to find suitable marriage partners for their largely unmarried, men, male citizens, right? It's just that the terminology as well as the recruitment efforts differ a little bit, right? So in South Korea and Taiwan, the migrant women who are recruited to marry, native Korean and Taiwanese men, respectively, actually have a marriage migrant visa, right? And they are referred to as marriage migrants, and most of them are either from mainland China or from Southeast Asian countries, and the vast majority enter their respective countries with that visa, right? So that's one distinguishing characteristic. Whereas in Japan's case, there have been a number of local efforts, especially in rural areas, to create kind of these matchmaking meetings between unmarried Japanese men and women, largely again in other Asian countries. But they aren't necessarily referred to as marriage migrants, and there isn't a specific visa category called marriage migrants. Rather, you're a spouse of a Japanese national or permanent resident. But again, the recruitment efforts are quite, emerged quite similarly. They largely started at the local level with kind of quasi, civil society and also local governments proactively, trying to create these matchmaking efforts between their unmarried male populations and foreign women. And in Japan's case, in many cases, these were women who were already in Japan, many of them who were Filipinas, for example. That actually became a really important base for the so-called marriage migrants, because quite a few, especially in the 70s, had arrived in Japan with entertainer visas, and they ended up settling in more rural communities and became kind of the central focus of these recruitment efforts. But if you look at some of the more commercial matchmaking agencies, the same language is used across all three countries in finding these suitable spouses, and not only for the men, but also for their aging parents, right? To take care of their aging parents, right?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, that's a big distinction.
So there's this pragmatic aspect of immigration, right? And Robbie asks what you think this whole impact of the digital disruption will be, right? So as we get better at using machines for checkouts and, instead of cashiers and clerks and using robots to take care of old people, will the demand for immigration decrease, and how would that change the story, right? Because Japan, at least, but I suspect Taiwan and Korea just the same, can be very pragmatic around these things. It's not a normative thing, yes, immigration is good or bad, right? It's a question of, is immigration useful? And so what's your crystal ball in terms of what not only the government, but also actually the civic societies group, how are they going to evolve around those issues?
So despite the ways in which there are alternative sources of labor, and there are non-human sources of kind of filling these labor gaps. I still think that the demand for migrant labor will be just as strong after all of this, right? As it was before, because the impending demographic crisis is not going to go away, right? So it's not just about the rapidly shrinking, workforce, right? It's also about the rapidly aging populations, right? And who will take care of them. And and by extension, the shrinking tax base that those aging populations produce in, largely the rural areas that have become depopulated, and that are also aging at rapid rates. And then, of course, the low fertility rates as well. So, I'm sure many of you have seen those, the population pyramids that have, basically reversed in the three countries, that, basically show that there is a dire need for population replacement in some way. And there have been a number of efforts by by governments in each country to address, these impending demographic crises, through, for example, encouraging women, to join to have children, or and also trying to create more family-friendly policies and so forth. So, and that's going to happen. And the other thing too is that Japan, of course, is was the most reluctant of the three countries to actually open its borders to unskilled immigration, and it finally did so in 2019 with the creation of a formal guest worker program, which marked the first time in post-war Japan that the country's borders were finally officially opened, right, to migrant workers. And this didn't come from kind of left-leaning parties or the opposition. This came right from the LDP, and specifically, this was an initiative that was very much embraced by Prime Minister Abe, right, former Prime Minister Abe, and the idea was that Japan could recruit up to 345,000 guest workers, in high demand areas like agriculture, construction, shipbuilding, hospitality, and nursing over a 5-year period. But the key understanding in all these three countries is that this is not considered to be a full-fledged immigration policy, right? It was it was meant to be a temporary, guest worker program where workers would come in and for a specific period of time, and then they would be returned, which bringing up the comparison that we discussed earlier with Germany, did not work for for Europe, right? But I do think that the fact that even Japan has initiated this policy demonstrates how necessary it is to create these, necessary it is to recruit immigrants, not only because of the larger national trends of depopulation, but because where these depopulation trends are mostly occurring. These are in rural areas, largely depopulated areas, right? So they're not just in the industries where you don't have much of a demand for employment, but also in the actual geographical areas where you already don't have many eligible workers.
So we have a large number of questions that probably will not be able to answer all, but I will send them to you tomorrow and we'll review them and see whether we can pick up some of them. But let me just group a few together. Mihoko asks about dual citizenship in the three countries, and Kanwal asks a related question, which is, will these three countries ever be a melting pot, right? Will they ever just be just open places? And then I'll just add the other question, which is a little bit not related, but you can weave them together. Jacob wonders what the future of these policies will be and what we should watch out for to see, right? So to the melting pot question, what would be some indicators to you that you would say, wow, that is different? This is new, right? So is there anything there that you would look out for? And then finally, the question from Robbie is there any advice you would have for President Biden that you've learned, right? So you're looking at civic society, which is a new vantage point in this entire thing. So is there a policy implication in your work? Is there anything you would tell Prime Minister Suga? Should Japan empower the grassroots? And if so, how? And is there anything we can learn in the United States from the insights you've gained? So that I put a lot on your plate, but there you go. Okay. Whatever you can answer is great.
So very quickly, I don't think that any of the three countries will ever become an open immigration, a melting pot. But Korea and Taiwan are much more resembling kind of traditional countries of immigration in terms of their naturalization rates, which are now catching up with most European countries, for example. Whereas in Japan, naturalization rates continue to be below 1% of the total foreign population. And it's been that way since 1952, right? And so that actually hasn't changed among the 6 generations of Zainichi Koreans or among the recent immigrants. Japan stands out actually in the high rates of permanent residency. So permanent residency rates are actually becoming quite high, and so that's such that that's become the norm. So in that respect, Japan actually stands out from Korea and from Korea and Taiwan. And then about the question about the future, the major indicators would be whether or not the policies, one, are implemented at the national level. In Japan's case, most of the immigrant incorporation policies have been implemented only at the local level, right? And this means that such issues such as police harassment or employment discrimination and housing discrimination cannot really be addressed, right, without structural reform. The other thing that I would look out for would be the implementation of anti-hate speech laws and anti-discrimination laws, which all three countries lack, right? So there is not actually a protective mechanism to fight against harassment and discrimination based on nationality. So that's, I think, very important. So I will just spend 30 seconds on the kind of the policy implications, which
that's fine. I mean, we're not going anywhere, so good answer.
So I think the policy implications is that, we can't really fix the problem of immigration through policy alone, right? So in South Korea's case, despite the passage of these rather progressive reforms, on the ground, immigrant incorporation is very much still quite incomplete, and in many ways it lags behind Japan, right? Because you don't see the same kinds of grassroots efforts at local incorporation, and so I think that among the three countries, Japan has been most successful in actually acknowledging and fostering the leadership of immigrants within the local communities and prioritizing their leadership rather than on treating them as victims or as subjects who need the assistance of the state. So this kind of this dual, of course you need structural reform, right, in order to actually protect migrant rights, but at the same time you do need kind of local grassroots efforts at fostering leadership and the political agency of immigrants themselves, right, in order to have this kind of more successful types of immigrant incorporation.
And would the United States benefit from such a thing?
Yes, because I mean, in some ways, the United States only has to look at Canada for that model, right? Because the United States largely has kind of the government plays a very minimal role in actually trying to incorporate immigrants. There are protections in place, right? But most of the actual legislation has been quite incomplete, which is why we see so many calls for immigration reform, right? But if you look at Canada's model, the government has spent has put a much greater amount of budget on immigrant incorporation efforts in actually trying to encourage immigrants to become participants in their local communities and participate in politics, right, as well as naturalize, right? So, basically, the national government cannot leave it up to civil society organizations alone, right? Who are constantly struggling, right, to also get funds and even to be recognized, right? There has to be a cooperative relationship between civil society and local and national governments in order to really have true immigration reform.
Well, that's a great point to stop. I could go on for hours. This is so interesting, Erin. Thank you for joining us today, and the audience stayed all the way to the end. So you have us on the edges of our seats. So thank you, Professor Erin Chung from Johns Hopkins University. And thank you all for joining us today. Stay well, stay healthy, take good care, and we'll see you next week with AJ Kiyoizumi to talk about contemporary Japanese art and why and how the highest price-fetching female artist in the world right now is from Japan. So with that, I'll see you next week, and be well. Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much.